Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I do want to thank the good chair for a very extensive, elaborate, and very appropriate answer to my question with regards to the purpose of this bill. I appreciate that. And that is the part of the bill that I feel is the good part of the bill that achieves the part of the bill, the language that is clear and achieves what we want to accomplish. And that is why, through you, Mr. Speaker, as the good chairman himself had referred to, Section 1, Section 2, and Section 3, so not Section 1, Section 2 and Section 3, which have been the more difficult part of this bill. Through you, Mr. Speaker, how does that enhance or reduce for us the purpose of this bill, which is to reduce the excessive force? Section 1, Section 2, and Section 3. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Tong.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, Sections 1, Sections 2, and Sections 3, I don't want to suggest are any less important. I think that they are critical to achieving the goal of avoiding excessive use of force and the larger goal of bringing us together. I think that we know from human experience and social science and just knowing what we know that spending time with one another, getting to know each other on a one-on-one basis, you and I, for example, is a foundation for trust and understanding. One example and anecdote that I learned about in college was how the proverbial Alabama farm boy, who's white, went away to Vietnam with a young black teenager from New York City. And they served together in Vietnam side by side as brothers. And though they have maybe were segregated or separated by race before that in the 60s, having served together, having invested in each other, and having become brothers through that process, they came back together as Americans and brothers in arms, and those barriers came down. So we know that that happens, and we also know that it happens on the street, that if there's a police officer who walks a beat and gets to know the owner of the corner shop and gets to know the residents of a public housing project and gets to know the kids that ride up and down every day after school on their bikes, that you build a foundation of trust and understanding and maybe share information. When something bad should happen, they tell the police officer. When a kid sees that a gun was stashed, this happened in this state, somewhere in a stairwell, they call the police officer in. They're not afraid of their own personal liability or that the police officer will somehow arrest them. They say, come, take that gun away from our public housing project. That is a critical relationship to public safety and law enforcement, and that relationship is enhanced. It's enhanced when people in the community interface with others who share some part of their experience. Maybe they look like them. Maybe they came to this country through a similar path. Maybe they grew up in a similar neighborhood. Maybe they worship the same God or same religion. So if you have that foundation, you can build that relationship to trust and avoid the excessive use of force that we have seen across the country. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, in Section 2, line 12, 13, and above, the municipalities or the law enforcement shall develop and implement guidelines for the recruitment, retention, and promotion of the minority officers. So through you, Mr. Speaker, will each and every law enforcement organization here in the state have their own guidelines and their own parameters? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Tong.
Through you, yes.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, will there be a body overseeing them to make sure that these guidelines that need to be followed, these guidelines that need to be implemented, are fair across the board as a state? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Tong.
Through you, yes, there is already a body that serves that function. We colloquially refer to it as POST. It's the Police Officer Standards and Training Council. I expect that they will interface with DESP and the leadership of our respective municipalities and come up with a framework that works for each city and town. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if we have such a body that oversees, what is then the need? Because my concern is these requirements may be different from municipality to municipality. What is the need for each and every one of them to come up with their own guidelines? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Tong.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, and that's a very good question that raises the question or answers the question of why we have Section 2 and Section 3. Each municipality, each department is different. They have a different reality on the ground. They have a different history in that city, and we want to give them the maximum amount of flexibility to promote the recruitment, retention, and promotion of minority police officers in the context of where they live. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, Section 3, line 20, talks about shall make efforts. Through you, Mr. Speaker, shall make efforts. If the good chair could elaborate. I do know later on there is an explanation of what those efforts could be or should be. Through you, Mr. Speaker, could the good chair tell us if these efforts are not made or not seem reasonable or fair? What are the consequences? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Tong.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the consequences are that the department would be in violation of the statute. There may be liability for that. And I can imagine that a claim could be made in court that there's a statute that's not being followed. And I think that every department in the state, I'm sure, is led by a police department, led by a police officer or chief or commissioner who has had a great deal of training in these issues and can formulate an effective plan for their municipality. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, for my clarification, I know the good chair has probably addressed this in different ways in our recent discussions. This concentration of minority residents, high concentration. So a minority resident, through you, Mr. Speaker, would that be a non-white? And every non-white resident comes under this classification of a minority resident. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Tong.
Through you, yes.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, as we go down the lines in Section 3, I know it's the Census Bureau that gives us the count as to what is the population in that particular town or city. Through you, Mr. Speaker, it is my understanding that there is a time lapse, a time gap between what the Census Bureau will tell us and what the reality is in that town. Through you, Mr. Speaker, will this number, this 50% number of the minority, only apply as per the Census Bureau? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Tong.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I would expect that the municipalities will rely on those census numbers to the extent that there is a time delay on updated census numbers, that the municipality would use the then operative census numbers. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do understand the intent of this bill, which, as I said earlier, is very laudable. But I do have difficulty as far as the language. But I do want to thank the good chair for his answers and will continue to listen to the debate this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, sir. Representative Ferraro.